thrilled to be here, as Nikki said. I think it is, I don't think I've ever been preceded in giving a talk by a band and then a gymnastic exercise. And I think from an intellectual perspective, I'm not sure I'm either as harmonious or as graceful as the previous performers. But I hope I will say some things this morning to you which will at least sharpen perhaps your interest in the issues that have certainly preoccupied me for many years now. I should say, when I was thinking about giving this talk, I was trying to think of some connection or some way to link myself to old Wingate, of course the great fellow Englishman of mine whose name is given to this institute. Of course, he was a great hero, and I am an economist. So that's almost the polar opposite of what he stood for. But nonetheless, one thing I did strike me about him reading his history is that he was never a man to believe that things should be done the way they have always been done. He believed in challenging the way of thinking that had been established. And what I want to talk to you about today really is perhaps challenging the received wisdom that you hear in much of sport management. So let me begin by, I'm going to put up a quote which really encapsulates that received wisdom. So this is a quote from perhaps, not perhaps, certainly the first published paper concerning the economics of sports. The economics of professional sports, published in 1956 by Simon Rottenberg in the Journal of Political Economy, and it is still probably the most cited article when people write about sport and economics. And the idea encapsulated in this paper and in this particular quote have had an enormous influence, not just amongst economists who think about this, but amongst policymakers, amongst sports organizations themselves, professional leagues, and indeed governments that are responsible for regulating sports activities. So this quote, he says, it is actually worth spending a few moments over. So he says, if it is argued, other things being equal, a team in an area with a large population has larger revenues than teams in less populous areas, then in a free players' labour market, the former will get the most capable players. There will be wide variation among teams in the quality of play. Contests will become certain, and attendance will decline. So there's a number of key steps that are made there, but the key idea here when talking about professional sport is that if there are teams that can generate large revenues and teams that can generate small revenues, then in a free market, without some kind of intervention, there will be a natural tendency for the large revenue teams to dominate, and that domination will spell disaster. Because contests will become certain, the team with the large revenue will be certain to win. And once it becomes certain to win, Rottenberg says attendance will decline. And he doesn't just mean attendance at the small market team. Clearly, they will be perpetual losers, so in that sense you wouldn't expect them to command a great deal of support, but he is making the point that for the winners also, this will be catastrophic. There will be a collapse of attendance because nobody will want to go see a team that is guaranteed to win. If you know the outcome of the game before it starts, why bother to go and watch? And this idea then that you need some uncertainty of outcome surrounding a professional sport in order to make it attractive to fans, in order to entice them to come and watch, has been a guiding light in the American perception of professional sports. And professional sports have developed most fully at the earliest date in the United States. If you think about professional sports like baseball, American football, basketball and so on, these have been highly developed leagues, and they have taken this principle to heart. And not only this, they have used these arguments to justify restraints amongst themselves, which limit the potential for the large revenue teams to dominate competition. So I'll go, at a later stage, I'll go through a list of some of these restraints, but the obvious ones that perhaps people are familiar with is the idea of a salary cap. The idea that you must limit the amount that each team can pay in order to prevent this imbalance from making the game certain and therefore reducing attendance for everybody. And indeed, this has been played out in front of the courts in the United States. Several cases concerning the administration of professional sports in the United States have reached the level of the Supreme Court, and before the Supreme Court, the leagues have argued with some success, essentially Rothenberg's argument. Although it's also worth noting that Rothenberg's argument starts with the word if. He actually did not state that this is necessarily true. He just said, if you believe this, then this would be the consequence. So my own history of research really goes back, starting in the early 1990s, to looking at European football. And European football as a structure actually looks rather different. And what I want to do is talk you through some of those differences. In fact, two key differences which I want to focus on, dominance and distress. So let me begin by talking about dominance and what I mean by dominance. Well, actually, what I'm going to talk about is an example which, if you follow the news, even if you're not really interested in football, most people in the last few weeks have heard the name Leicester City repeated, even in the United States, where English soccer is not that big of a deal. There have been many stories on national news programs talking about Leicester City, essentially the miracle of Leicester City. So Leicester City is interesting because they are the team that has just 2 weeks ago, they won the English Premier League Championship, and this was a surprise. In fact, it was, if you had bet on this outcome last August when the league season started, you would have got odds of 5,000 to 1. And just to put that in context, what do odds of 5,000 to 1 look like? Well, imagine you toss a coin and you start tossing a coin and you keep tossing it and 13 times in a row it comes up heads. That's about 5,000 to 1 odds. And bear in mind, you don't get to restart if it comes down tails once. You've got to go one try, and 13 times it comes up heads. That's as likely as Leicester City winning the title this year, and yet they did it. They won. And essentially, this table shows you why nobody believed that they could do it at the start of the season and why it is such an extraordinary outcome. This lists the estimated value of the players in the market. And remember, there is a market for players. In soccer, players move all the time. We read in the newspapers about large transfer fees paid for players. So there is a ready market for the players. And if I just listed 6 teams whose squad values were estimated to be between 2.5 and 4 times larger than Leicester City's at the beginning of the season. If you think about Leicester City, say, going up against Manchester City, you should expect Leicester City with 4 times the value of the team to win more often than not. And, of course, if they just play once, anything can happen. Upsets can happen. But if you play over and over again, you would expect Manchester City to come out on top more often than not. Well, throughout a league season, Leicester City had to play against these teams, each of which had substantially better resources. And yet Leicester City managed to come consistently ahead of all of these teams. And that's what makes it such a striking example. And so this has, and it's ignited a great deal of interest and discussion about Leicester City and about how this can happen. But one thing, what I really want to focus on is just how extraordinary an event this is by putting this in some kind of historical context, thinking about the way that football actually operates in England and in the rest of Europe. So, I ranked the teams by value. So you can see there, out of the 20 teams in the Premier League, Leicester was ranked, its value of its team at the beginning of the season was ranked 12th. So, which is 20 teams in the league, so bottom half of the league, essentially. So let's think about who has won the Premier League in the past, and think about where their rank would have been in the seasons in which they won. And that's in my next paper. So, between over 20 seasons between the Premier League, between 1993 and 2014, the team with the highest spending won 9 times, the team with the second highest spending won 9 times, the team with the third highest spending won 3 times, and then once the team with the fourth highest weight bill. And anything below that never won in this period. So in fact, this illustrates just how exceptional the Leicester City achievement is. This is not something that happened. If I went back even more years, as I could, then we'd see the same story emerging. Almost always, the team that spends the most is the one that wins, which is just another way of saying there's a market for players, and if you've got the best players, you will win the league, because what the reasons are, again, I'll come back to this. So, that translates into dominance over time. The same teams tend to win over and over again. And it's not just true in England. So here I've listed, I picked 10 national leagues, the top divisions in 10 national leagues, and I've chosen big ones like England and Spain, and then very small ones like the Faroe Islands and the Republic of Ireland. Because what's interesting to me about these is that the pattern is the same for all of these leagues. If you see it, so I put 2 statistics on here. What is the most number of wins of the national championship by any one team over the last half century? And then you can see that's the middle column, and then you can see that ranges from Spain and Norway, where one team no less has won no less than 22 out of the last 50 contests. So obviously people would be familiar with Spain, that's Real Madrid. In there, Norway is Rosenborg, and even in the tiny Faroe Islands, there's a team called HB, which has won 19 of the last 50 titles in that country. And you can see that in the final column there's a different kind of way of representing this, which shows how many different teams have won the National League title in the last 50 years. And that ranges from as few as 5 in Turkey. Only 5 teams in the last 50 years have won the title in Turkey. Up to, at most, in the Republic of Ireland, 50 teams, over 50 years. Still, only 15 out of 50 in total. So you can see here that there is a tendency across all leagues, no matter how big or small, for the same teams to dominate over time, and for there to be very strongly dominant teams. Well, you might say, well, compared to what? Compared to what is my standard? Well, one standard you could look at is compared with the United States. So let's look at the last half century and include the 4 professional leagues in the United States: Major League Baseball, the NFL, the National Hockey League, and the NBA. Well, and you can see here that, and I've ranked them this time by the most league championships won in the last 50 years, And you can see here that in, for example, the NFL, only the most number of wins by any one team in half a century is 6. So that's substantially less than in any European league. And then over the last half century, 19 different teams have won the Super Bowl, which is substantially more than in any of the European leagues. As you can see in baseball, actually, they've had one team that's won 7 titles, so slightly more dominant over 50 years, but 23 different teams have won the World Series. Bear in mind, there are only 30 teams in Major League Baseball. And indeed, over this half century, there were not 30 teams. At some points, there were actually fewer teams than 30. And nonetheless, almost every single team in Major League Baseball has won a World Series. But whereas hardly any teams in most of these European leagues have actually ever won a national title. You can see the NBA and the NHL somewhere in the middle there, and in fact, you know, in my list, Poland, France, and the Republic of Ireland are outliers in this. With all due respect, not 3 of the most important leagues in world football. And even then, if you look at the total number of teams winning, there are more champions in the NBA and the NHL than in those 3 football leagues. In fact, if I actually now look at this over a slightly more recent period, just look at the last quarter century, then on this basis, the 4 US leagues come right at the bottom. Again, the maximum number of wins in the last 25 years by one team in the North American leagues is either 5 or 4 over a quarter century. Whereas in Norway, you had no less than 17 titles won by one team. In England, you have Manchester United with 13 of the last 25, Spain with Real Madrid with 12 of the last 25. So again, an incredible amount of dominance. And again, apart from maybe France, the Republic of Ireland, now Hungary comes in, you have very few winners over a period of 25 years. Again, in Turkey, only 4 teams in a quarter of a century. So if I put that into an average, then just make the point that dominance is this incredibly striking feature of European football. So if you take either the last 50 years or the last 25 years, and you look at either the most league championships by one team or the number of different teams winning the league championship, the number in Europe is about half the number in the North American league, roughly speaking. So that's a very significant difference in the extent of dominance. Now there are other ways we can measure dominance. There's a big economics and sports literature about how to measure dominance in leagues. But so I focused on one particular measure here, but any other measure is going to produce more or less the same result. So dominance is one of the 2 features. The other feature is distress. So distress has been a very typical feature of European football for a very long time. UEFA has been very concerned about this. UEFA, the governing body of European football, has talked about this a great deal. So back in 2011, they revealed this, looking at just the top divisions, which covered something like 700 different clubs. 56% of these clubs lost money. 36% reported negative net equity, and 1 in 6 essentially were deemed by their auditors to be at risk of no longer being a going concern. In other words, on the brink of financial collapse. This is a report from 2011, but this is a story which is repeated over and over again over time across almost every single European league. League clubs struggle financially and are almost always about to collapse, or a large fraction are almost always about to collapse. So this is a chart. I'm afraid the writing on the horizontal axis is not very clear, but basically this is the entire post-war period in England So from 1947 up to 2010, the blue vertical lines are incidences of insolvency when clubs enter into legal insolvency proceedings involving the courts. And the red line is the total attendance at the 4 divisions of English football. And what's very striking about this is how much distress there's been in the last 25 years. How many times clubs have actually had to enter insolvency proceedings. In the last, since 1982, there have been approximately 70 separate cases. So in what, a 30-year period, 35-year period, we're talking about a very high level of distress. And what's also striking about this chart is it doesn't seem to have much to do with the actual success of the league. So in the post-war period from 1949 roughly up until 1985, attendances were declining in England, and yet there was very little distress in the form of formal insolvency proceedings. And then, since 1985, attendance has risen quite dramatically, and yet insolvency has also risen dramatically. Clubs are living more and more on the edge of on the brink of financial collapse. And it's not just in England. So there is a lot of talk, if you read the newspapers, if you follow football, there's actually quite a lot of talk about financial distress in England. But it's not just in England. So I have been with fellow researchers in France and Germany, we've been looking at how much distress there is in all of these leagues. And this looks at just looking at the top 3 divisions for each country. And there's something you can see that in England, just looking at the top 3 divisions, we have just under 40 cases over a period of 25 years. In France, we have nearly 50 cases, and in Germany, we have almost 30 cases. So it seems like it's a very common event almost everywhere. So, to summarize that with the insolvency rate, so what percentage of clubs become insolvent on average in each season? And typically, we're talking about a population of around 100 clubs in each case. So roughly between 1 and 3 clubs in each country can expect to enter legal insolvency proceedings every single season, which is really quite a high level of insolvency amongst these organizations. So insolvency and distress is a chronic problem in European football. Sorry, just to mention, of course, and just think about other countries, Spain, they've actually had to change the laws on at least 2 occasions now to deal with the financial collapse of football clubs. They're currently going through a process where the government is imposing restrictions in order to get them to repay some of their debts. In Italy, it's been very common too. It's somewhat harder to document exactly how frequent it is. And then once you get to smaller leagues, it seems even more frequent. So it's certainly, these are just three of the larger countries with the bigger leagues, which you'd actually expect to be more solvent, whereas in fact, you can see even in these countries very high rates of insolvency. Now, one of the things to say is that these football clubs, they rise from the ashes. What happens in almost every single one of these cases is that the business that owns the football club collapses and is liquidated, but the club is taken over by somebody else. And to understand that, you have to recognize that these clubs do 2 things. So firstly, it's very unusual to be able to take a stadium and then use it for some other purpose. Stadiums are potentially valuable real estate. You could turn them into apartment blocks, you could build supermarkets, and often these stadiums are built quite close to the centre of town, so they actually are in very attractive locations. But across Europe, almost no local government will allow that to happen. If you try to do that, they will impose planning restrictions to prevent that outcome from occurring. So in some ways, even if the business that owns the football club is bankrupt, a new owner can't really change the business. It still has to stay in the business of football. And then, of course, football is part of the community in Europe. So a club isn't just a business, in some sense it's a community asset. People in every town feel they have some ownership of their football club, and that's why local people are quite happy to find ways to refinance a club even once it's gone through bankruptcy, or even after it's gone through bankruptcy many times. And we see this happening over and over again. And one thing I want to explain, why does this happen? Why do we see this level of, why do we see this combined level of dominance and distress in football? And I want to stress that I believe it's because of the way that the market operates. So this chart here, again, using data from England, where we know how much clubs pay out in wages and compare that to the league position that they achieve. This chart shows that essentially you get what you pay for. As you go further to the right on the horizontal scale, the clubs are spending more and more money on wages, and as you go further and further up on the vertical scale, the higher league position you're achieving. And you can see that most of these clubs lie on the diagonal line, and that regression line there suggests a correlation of roughly 0.9 between wage spending and performance. Now, I'm not going to get into a long discussion about the difference between correlation and causation today, which is an interesting subject in its own right, but just to say that this is one of the reasons why you would expect to see dominance, because if you are willing to spend more money, if you have the capacity to spend more money, you will win. And conversely, if you run out of money and you have no money to spend, you will start to lose. So in other words, there's a very clear relationship between what you pay and what you get. But also combined with that winning pays also. So if you're prepared to spend, this chart shows the relationship between the revenue that the club generates and the league position. Now the league position is on the horizontal axis and the revenue is on the vertical axis. And again, you see a similar correlation of about 0.9, and you get the same result, the same kind of result, which is if you get a higher league position, the money will come. So essentially what you can think of is the way this works is if you can put lots of money in, you can be very successful because that will generate revenue, people will come to watch your team. So you can also see that everybody's going to try to do this, but only a few can succeed. So that's why you're going to end up with a lot of financial failure as well. Those attempting to achieve this, many of them, most of them are destined to fail. And it's not cheap now. The question is, how much money do you have to spend to get to the top right-hand corner in these charts? Well, if we think of this as two examples, Manchester City and Chelsea, each of the owners of these clubs was prepared over a period of 5 to 6 years to commit about between $1.5 and $2 billion, that's each, to buying the talent to make the team win, which is money they'll never get back. The revenues of these clubs went up, but now the revenues that they generate are only just enough to cover the costs of maintaining the teams that they built. In other words, the investment they put in, that's never coming back. So in that sense, you can buy success, and some people will buy success, but that illustrates just how hard it's going to be for teams below that, and how, unless these are the only kinds of clubs now that are getting to reach the top positions, accepting the extraordinary results of Leicester City, of course. But these clubs are managing to move themselves into the top level consistently by spending much, much more. So you can buy success, but buying success is expensive. Few teams can afford to buy it. The teams that are at the top today tend to be the teams that have been buying success for many, many years and that have an established position. And most clubs are trying to rival that by trying to match their expenditure, but they're failing. And many of them are failing by falling into bankruptcy and financial distress. That's essentially the story of European football, which is about as far as you can get from the story of Simon Rottenberg. Well, what would Rottenberg say? Rottenberg would say, this is a league, this is a system that will collapse and fail. This cannot work. But that's not the case. European football is today, I would argue, the most successful sporting structure in the world. So here, according to Deloitte, the accountants, the European football market, the revenue in the European football market is now approximately 25 billion euros. So to compare that, the revenues of the three biggest leagues in the United States, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA, they are only just over 25 billion euros. So when we talk about commercial success, now this is not to say that those American leagues are not commercial successes. They are. They're some of the greatest, most successful sports businesses in the world. But European football is even more successful. Now, it hasn't always been true. If you go back 25 years, you'll find that, in fact, the revenues of European football would have been less than any one of those three. So we have lived in a period of transition where sport in general has grown, professional sport in general, the revenues of all these leagues have risen, but the revenues of European football have been rising much, much faster than the revenues of any other professional sport. And I would say there's zero evidence to suggest this is not going to continue. If anything, this dominance looks likely to increase within this structure. So there you have the paradox, if you like. You have this world where Rottenberg says that if you have this dominance, the league structure will fail, but in reality, what we see is a European structure which is characterized by dominance and distress, but is actually very successful. This chart is a convenient way, I think, of showing the difference between the American structure and the European structure. So this is data generated by Forbes magazine that publishes annually their estimates of the market value of sports franchises in the United States and the 20 largest football clubs in Europe. So the value of the American franchises is the solid line. And this is for the three largest leagues, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA. And I've ranked them. I've ranked the value of the franchises from the most valuable, which would be the Yankees and the Dallas Cowboys, down to the least valuable, which I can't remember either what they are, but they're some NHL franchise or other, I think, at the bottom there. And if you compare that, the dotted line are the valuations of the 20 largest football clubs in Europe. Now, they only value the 20 largest. They don't value as many clubs as they value American franchises. But one thing you do, you can do this in your head, you can extrapolate, you can see if they're the 20 most valuable football clubs in Europe, the next 70 or so are not going to be worth very much. That line is going to trend towards zero pretty quickly, and so you'll see, for any level, you'll see a gap. Now, the most valuable sports franchises in the world are actually the football clubs. Real Madrid, Manchester United, maybe Barcelona, maybe Bayern Munich, those four would be the four biggest at the moment. And they are bigger, more valuable than any North American franchise. But once you get beyond those, every single American franchise is more valuable. And if you look at the total value, if you add it all up, then the difference between the value of the American franchises and the value of the football clubs the 100 largest, if you take the 100 largest of each, the value of the American franchises is more than double in total. So what the Americans have done is they've created a business which is incredibly successful, where the assets themselves are incredibly valuable. Whereas in European football, the value of the clubs, the value to the shareholders, is, once you get beyond the top few, is almost nothing. And that's not accidental. The fundamental proposition in economics is if you have competitive markets, profits will be driven down to zero. And that firms faced with competitive markets will naturally try to collude amongst themselves in order to restrict competition. Adam Smith said, more than 200 years ago, said that two tradesmen seldom meet, but that the conversation turns to some mechanism to defraud the public. In other words, that they will engage in cartels, they will engage in restrictions in order to increase their profitability, to raise prices and limit competition. And these are all the ways that they do it in the American markets. They fix the number of teams, they impose exclusive territories, they have collective selling of broadcast rights, merchandising, and they restrict who can even own these clubs. And then in the labour markets, they have draft rules which restrict who you can negotiate with as a player. They limit the number of players that you can hire. They have salary caps, they have luxury taxes, and they have rules to restrict, prevent clubs from trading players. And all of these rules help to make the league profitable. And that's just, again, I would say that's more or less economics 101. This would be a textbook example in classroom of how you make money in a market. And yet, why do they get away with this? All the way back to my first slide, and the quote from Rottenberg is the reason that they get away with it. They're allowed to do this because everybody has bought the argument that you need, that if you have too much inequality, then the outcome will become certain and attendance will decline. And leading amongst that the courts have bought it, the politicians have bought it, but leading amongst that, the academics have bought it. Open any text on sport management, and almost line one is some version of uncertainty of outcome and competitive balance are necessary to establish a successful sports team. And I hope what I've shown you this morning is that's just not the case. There may be other reasons that European football is successful. There may be other things that can account for it, but competitive balance and uncertainty of outcome, barring the extreme examples of Leicester City, of clubs like Leicester City, that is just not characteristic of professional football in Europe. So, just to conclude, the free market in the European model, strangely enough, perhaps surprisingly, has been extremely successful. And people are always talking about the collapse of football in Europe, and without noticing just how absolutely successful it is. What's striking about this, one thing that the paradox that people always come away with this is so unusual because it's completely the opposite way that we think about America and Europe. So we think about America as the home of free market capitalism, unrestrained markets, everybody works for themselves, and we think of Europe as being this kind of socialist paradise where everybody gets looked after from cradle to grave, there's no free enterprise and so forth. And in sporting terms, it's the complete opposite. In the American system, looks like socialism. There's a limited number of clubs, and they work together to ensure equality of outcome. They seem very focused on making sure that the outcome is pretty much the same for everybody. Whereas in Europe, we have unfettered competition amongst clubs. We have, thanks to the promotion and relegation system, anybody can hope one day to run a club that could play in the Champions League. And yet, and so we have equality of opportunity, but we have this incredible inequality of outcome. But I think for a sports science congress, what I'd like to say is, my own view is that more research is really needed to think about this. We need to rethink the standard text, the standard textbook explanation of why we need competitive balance, and to think more about why European football has been so incredibly successful over the last 25 years, and to develop new theories and perhaps new tests to see what the real underlying driving factors are. Thank you very much for your